At 4:15 in the morning, Terminal C of Logan Airport was nearly empty, and the man standing in the middle of the corridor looked like no one else awake at that hour. 3 men in suits stood a few steps behind him, silent as statues. He walked over to the young woman, pushing a mop across the floor, and asked which way led to the private aircraft terminal. Adeline Kerrigan did not look up. She had cleaned that corridor for 4 years, and had answered that question more times than she could count. She pointed toward the far end, said Gate D9, turned left past the customs desk, then bent down and went back to her work. The man did not move. He stood there, and she felt something shift in the air, the kind of shift that makes a person look up on instinct. He was not looking at her face. He was looking at her left wrist, where a bracelet woven from tarnished copper wire hung loose, a small metal tag swinging with every push of the mop. She pulled her sleeve down to cover it, the way she had 1,000 times before under curious eyes. But this man was not curious. His face had gone white. One of the men in suits stepped forward to remind him the plane had been waiting 20 minutes, and the other side was calling. He did not turn around. He said only 3 words, his voice gone hoarse, as though someone had just closed a hand around his throat. Cancel the flight. The man behind him froze. Across the tarmac, the pilot took the call and could not believe what he was hearing, because in 11 years, no one had ever seen Emmett Vasari cancel anything. And Adeline stood there still, gripping the handle of her mop, with no idea at all that the man in front of her had spent 20 years searching for the owner of that bracelet, and had long since been certain that she was no longer alive. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we'll know you stayed with the characters until the very end. Share it with someone you once owed a thank you that you never had the chance to say. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because there are still many more stories waiting to be told to you. The man asked her 3 questions, no more. The first was where the bracelet had come from. Adeline said she didn't know. She had worn it since before she was old enough to remember. The second was what her name was. She read the name printed on the employee badge hanging against her chest, her voice as flat and detached as if she were reciting it for a health inspector. The third was what year she had been born. Adeline stopped. She looked up and met his eyes for the first time since he had approached her, and she saw something that 4 years of night shifts at the airport had never shown her on the face of any passenger. This man wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He was waiting for her answer as though he were waiting for a verdict. Adeline released the mop handle, straightened, and told him she wouldn't answer that question. Then she continued, slowly and clearly, explaining that the rules at her workplace prohibited members of the cleaning staff from stopping to speak with passengers for too long, and that if he needed anything else, the information desk was downstairs. He didn't move. He asked her once more softly this time, almost pleading, whether she could please tell him the year she was born. And it was that voice that frightened Adeline. She had heard every kind of voice during her 4 years in that corridor. The voice of someone drunk, the voice of someone who had just missed a flight, the voices of men who believed a woman holding a mop could be bought as easily as a cup of coffee. She knew how to handle every one of those voices, but she had no idea how to handle a man wearing a suit that cost more than an entire year of her rent, standing in an empty terminal at 4 o'clock in the morning and asking for the year of her birth, in a voice that made it sound as though her answer would decide whether he could go on breathing. Adeline stepped back half a pace, pulled her cleaning cart between them, and asked him, "What do you want from me?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Adeline waited. She counted 5 beats, 6 beats, 7 beats, and throughout those 7 beats, the man standing before her couldn't utter a single word. None of the 3 men in suits behind him dared to speak either. The only sounds left in the corridor were the hum of the air conditioning and the squeak of her cart's wheels as she turned it around. Adeline said she still had 8 restrooms to clean before 6 o'clock, and then she walked away. She didn't run. She moved at the same steady pace she kept every night, both hands resting on the cart handle, her eyes fixed straight ahead, because one of the first things a person learned after living alone since the age of 18 was never to let a stranger see her fear. The man didn't follow her. He remained exactly where he was until she disappeared around the corner. Then he turned to the oldest man in the group, the one who had stood silently behind him from the beginning, and gave him exactly 2 orders. Find out everything there is to know about her, and don't let anyone touch her. Malachi Doyle nodded. He had stood beside this family for more than 30 years and had heard thousands of commands, and he knew at once that the second one was the real order. He asked whether they should send word to the associates in Montreal. They had been waiting since midnight, and they would want to know why. Emmett Vasari looked toward the far end of the corridor, where the strip of wet floor she had just mopped hadn't yet had time to dry. "Tell them I'm not coming," he replied. "No reason." At 6 o'clock in the morning, Adeline returned the cart to the supply room, signed her name in the shift handover log, and told no one what had just happened in Terminal C, because there was no point in telling anyone. She caught the first bus of the day, changed routes once, and arrived at the hospital at 6:45, just as she had every morning for the past 7 months. Corey was in the rehabilitation room, both hands gripping the parallel bars as he tried once more to lift himself out of his wheelchair. He was 19 years old. He saw his sister standing in the doorway and smiled at once, the quick, hurried smile of a younger brother who wanted her to see him smiling before she had time to see him hurting. Adeline knew better. She had raised him since he was 7, and she could read him as easily as she read her own work schedule. She sat on the edge of a chair and told him to keep going, not to pay any attention to her. Corey lifted himself 3 more times, his arms trembling violently, sweat running down his temples, and on the 3rd attempt, he dropped heavily back into the chair and told his sister that he had held himself up 4 seconds longer today than he had yesterday. Adeline said 4 seconds was a lot. She meant it. People like to believe a life changed because of great events, but she had learned long ago that a life changed because of 4 seconds, because of a single sheet of paper, because of a phone call in the middle of the night. 9 months earlier, she had received that call while mopping the 3rd floor of the terminal. They told her that the scaffolding at the construction site on Preston Street had collapsed, that her brother had been underneath it. And from that moment until now, she hadn't slept more than 4 hours in a single day. The head nurse called her into the hallway. She didn't waste time softening the truth. She handed Adeline the estimate for the surgery and said the specialist had agreed to take Corey's case, that this was the best chance he had, but the surgical slot would only be held for 3 weeks before it was given to another patient on the waiting list. Adeline held the paper in her hands. The figure was printed on the final line, $180,000. She read it 3 times, not because she didn't understand it, but because she was trying to find some place where she might have read it wrong. She asked whether there was any way to pay in installments. The nurse said the hospital had a financial assistance program, but Adeline's application had already been submitted and rejected the month before because her income wasn't sufficient to demonstrate an ability to pay. Adeline nodded, thanked her, folded the paper into quarters, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. She went back into the rehabilitation room, kissed her brother on the forehead, told him she would bring him the egg sandwich he liked that afternoon, and then walked out on the legs of someone who had just heard her sentence pronounced, but still had to catch the 8 o'clock bus. When she reached her rented apartment on the 4th floor of a building in Dorchester, she found a notice taped to the door. She didn't need to open it to know what it was. It concerned the $19,000 loan she had signed for in February to cover the first round of hospital bills, a loan taken out in Adeline Kerrigan's name rather than her brother's because Corey had no income and because she didn't want him to know. 3 consecutive payments were overdue. The lender demanded full payment within 15 days. She pulled the notice from the door, tucked it into her coat pocket beside the surgical estimate, and for 1 second she stood there, thinking that this pocket held her entire life, folded up and stacked one sheet upon another, without a single piece of good news among them. Then she opened the door, took a cold shower because the water heater had been broken since the week before, changed into her still damp diner uniform, and left for her second shift. At 7 o'clock that evening, with her hands submerged in a sink full of dishwater at the diner on Bennington Street, she turned the bracelet around her left wrist, out of habit, and the metal tag made a dry little clattering sound, as though there were 2 layers inside it. At 9 o'clock that evening, only 2 tables were still occupied at the diner on Bennington Street, and the glass door opened while Adeline was wiping down the counter. She recognized the man before he had even stepped fully inside, not because of his suit, but because of the way everyone else in the diner automatically stopped talking as he walked past. He chose the last table by the window, sat with his back to the wall, and ordered a cup of coffee. Adeline brought it over, set it down, and walked away. When she glanced back 10 minutes later, the coffee was untouched. It was still untouched after 20 minutes. He never took a single sip, and she understood that he had ordered it only to give himself a reason to stay. At 10 o'clock, the owner turned the sign to closed. The customers at the other 2 tables paid and left, and the only things remaining in the diner were Adeline, the man, and the sound of the dishwasher running in the back. She approached his table with the check in her hand, set it down, and told him the diner was closed. He didn't pick up the check. He reached into his coat, took something out, and placed it on the table, turning it toward her. It was an old photograph. Adeline was about to tell him she didn't have time for this, but her eyes had already fallen on it, and she stopped. In the photograph, a little boy and a little girl were sitting on the concrete steps of a building. She stared at it for a long time. She stared so long that the dishwasher completed an entire cycle and beeped from the back of the kitchen, but she didn't hear it. She didn't recognize those steps. She didn't recognize that building. She didn't recognize the boy, but her hand had already risen to her left wrist, and she only realized what she was doing when her fingers touched that familiar place. Adeline pushed the photograph back toward him and said she didn't remember anything. She said she couldn't remember where she had lived before she was 8, couldn't remember her parents' faces, couldn't remember anything, except for a few fragments. She wasn't even certain were real memories or things she had created to fill the empty spaces. She said she had stopped trying to remember a long time ago. The man didn't push the photograph toward her again. He only said, very softly, "You don't need to remember. I remember enough for both of us." Adeline stood there with the cleaning cloth in her hand, and she didn't know what to do with those words. He continued, still without looking up. He said he knew about her brother. He knew about the surgery, knew the surgical slot would only be held for 3 weeks, and even knew the figure printed on the last line of the estimate she had folded into quarters and slipped into her coat pocket that afternoon. He said he would pay for all of it. It wouldn't be a loan. There would be no installments. She wouldn't have to sign anything. The hospital would receive the money the next morning, and she would never have to look at that piece of paper again. Adeline remained silent. Inside her mind, one part of her was screaming at her to nod. Just nod, and Corey would walk again. Just nod, and the next 15 days would no longer be the final 15 days. But she was 27 years old, and she had lived in 4 foster homes, and there were some lessons a person learned once and carried for the rest of her life. She pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, placed the cleaning cloth on the table, and told him she wouldn't accept. He asked why. Adeline said, "People have given me leftover food. They've given me old clothes. They've let me sleep on the sofa in their living rooms. When I was 16, I understood that everything given for free comes with a price. People simply don't tell you what that price is when they hand it to you. I can't afford your price." The man lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time in the 2 times they had met, Adeline saw that he had no answer. He picked up the photograph, looked at it for a second, then slipped it back into his coat. He rose, left an amount on the table many times greater than the cost of the coffee he hadn't touched, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without turning around and said that her father had once told him something, and that he had lived by those words for 20 years. Then he stepped outside before she could ask what her father had said. 3 nights later, Adeline finished her shift at 6 o'clock in the morning and walked out to the employee parking lot behind Terminal C, where she always chained her bicycle to the second lamppost. 2 men were standing beside that post. They didn't block her path. They merely stood close enough for her to understand that they were waiting for her and no one else. The older man asked whether she was Adeline Kerrigan, and when she didn't answer, he recited the address of her apartment in Dorchester, the floor she lived on, and even the time she usually came home. He said the lender had sold her $19,000 debt, that it now belonged to someone else, and that the new owner didn't conduct business through notices taped to doors. Adeline stood still. She neither stepped back nor moved forward. 4 years of night shifts at a major airport had taught her that the moment people saw her fear was the moment they began demanding a higher price. She asked him for the amount. He hesitated slightly, perhaps because he had prepared himself for tears or a flood of pleading, not for a question that brief. He told her the entire balance, plus interest, was due within 7 days. Adeline said she earned $420 a week at the airport and $260 at the diner. She said she could pay $300 a week, no more, and if he forced her to lose her jobs, the amount he would receive each week would be nothing. She said she wasn't running away. Her name was on the contract. She had an address and 2 places of employment, and people like her had nowhere else to go. The other man laughed and said he had no authority to negotiate. At that moment, a black car stopped several yards away. Its headlights swept across the parking lot and went dark. No one stepped out. The rear window lowered by about a hand's width. The man inside spoke a single sentence, so brief that Adeline couldn't hear all of it. She caught only the final two words, which were her name. The two men fell silent at once. The older one looked toward the car, then at Adeline, then took one step back, and both men walked straight toward the parking lot gate, without looking behind them. Adeline stood there for a long moment, holding her bicycle keys in her hand. Then she walked over to the black car and tapped on the window. It lowered all the way. She asked who he was. The man inside looked at her and said he was someone trying not to lie to her. Adeline said that wasn't an answer. He said it was the most honest answer he could give her at that moment, and that if she wanted a name, his name was Emmett Vasari. But if she wanted to know what he did, he would answer that question on a day when she truly wanted to hear it, not at 6 o'clock in the morning in a parking lot. She started to turn away. He added that he hadn't come to offer her money again. He had a job and needed to hire someone. There was an apartment in Sumner Hill whose rent he had continued paying for 20 years. No one lived there, no one cleaned it, and he needed someone to look after it, sweep and clean, replace the locks, and repair whatever was broken, a few times each week, with wages paid weekly. Adeline asked why he had chosen her. He said it was because he didn't want to hire anyone else. She stood motionless for a long time, knowing perfectly well that this was still charity, except that this time it had been dressed in something she could wear without feeling ashamed. Corey had 18 days left. She said she would accept, but she had 3 conditions. First, she would accept wages, not gifts, and if any money appeared in her life that she hadn't earned, she would return it the following day. Second, the debt bearing her name belonged to her, and he wasn't allowed to touch it, buy it, or erase it. Third, she had the right to walk away at any time, without owing him a single word of explanation. Emmett Vasari listened to everything without interrupting her once. Then he nodded and said, "Agreed, agreed, and agreed." Exactly 3 times, one for each condition. Before the car window rose, Emmett handed her a folded piece of paper bearing an address and apartment number, along with a tarnished brass key. Adeline slipped both into her coat pocket without opening the paper, because she still had a bus to catch, and because she was accustomed to letting strange things wait until she had time for them. She didn't unfold it until 9 o'clock that morning, while standing in the hospital corridor waiting for Corey to finish his physical therapy session. She read the line written on the paper. Then she read it again. Something inside her chest sank very slowly, like a broken elevator. 41 Holloway Street, Sumner Hill, apartment number 4. Adeline knew that address. She didn't remember the rooms, the staircase, or the face of anyone who had lived in the building, but she had written that address dozens of times throughout her life, in the section marked Last Known Residence on foster care forms, on her 4th grade enrollment records, and on the application for a replacement birth certificate when she was 18, and filing the paperwork to reclaim her father's last name. It was the address of the home where she had lived before she turned 8. She stood in the middle of the hospital corridor with the paper in her hand, and a passing nurse had to ask whether she was all right. Adeline said she was fine. At 9 o'clock that night, she went to Sumner Hill. The building was low and old, 4 stories tall, with a narrow staircase winding upward. She climbed to the 2nd floor. The door to apartment number 4 stood at the end of the hallway. She slipped the key into the lock, and it turned as smoothly as though someone had oiled it the week before, and that was what made her hand begin to tremble. She pushed the door open. The rooms beyond were dark and cold, and carried the smell of a place where no one had breathed in a very long time. She turned on the lights. Adeline walked slowly through every room without touching anything, waiting for something inside her mind to open. Nothing did. She was 27 years old, standing inside the home of her own childhood, like a stranger inspecting an apartment for rent. She was about to leave when she stopped in the kitchen doorway. On the edge of the wooden frame, level with her hip, were 2 pencil marks. The upper mark was slightly higher, with a name written beside it in an adult's handwriting. The lower mark was much farther down, and beside it was another name written in the same hand. Adeline didn't need to bend over to read it. She had seen her own name from 2 steps away. She stood there for a very long time. Then she raised her hand, pressed her palm against the lower mark, and held it there, realizing that her hand was now larger than the height some man had once measured for her 20 years earlier. She didn't cry. She simply stood there and breathed, counting each breath the way she did during the longest night shifts, until she heard a quiet cough in the hallway. Malachi Doyle stood outside the door without entering, his hands clasped behind his back like a man who had spent 30 years waiting at thresholds. Adeline asked whether he knew who had drawn those lines. He didn't answer the question. He looked over her shoulder into the apartment whose threshold he wouldn't cross either, then said softly, almost to himself, that Emmett had paid the rent on this place for 20 years, on time every month, without ever being late once. Adeline asked how many times he had come up here. Malachi was silent for a moment before answering. Not once. He has never stepped inside. Adeline called him that same night from the second-floor hallway, and she said only one thing. Come up here. 40 minutes later, Emmett Vasari stood at the top of the staircase. He didn't climb the final step. He stopped there with one hand resting on the railing, and Adeline understood that the man who had paid the rent on this apartment for 20 years was afraid to take 4 more steps. She asked him how he knew this address. He said it was because he had lived there. Then he told her the story, briefly and without emotion, in the voice of a man reading from an official report rather than recounting his own life. When he was 14, his father got into trouble. He used exactly those 3 words and offered no further explanation. His entire family had been forced to leave their large house north of the city in a single night, taking only 2 suitcases. And for the next 3 months, they lived on the 3rd floor of this building under a name that wasn't their own. His mother didn't leave the apartment for the entire first week. Emmett had been instructed not to speak to anyone, not to tell anyone where he had come from, and not to let anyone remember his face. Everyone in the building was curious. People watched them on the stairs, asked the landlady questions without asking them directly, and made one wild guess after another. Only one person never asked anything. He was the electrician who lived on the 2nd floor in apartment number 4, and his name was Hollis Kerrigan. Emmett said that on the first Tuesday night, when the circuit breaker for the entire 3rd floor tripped, and his mother was too afraid to call an electrician because she didn't want a stranger entering the apartment, Hollis came upstairs on his own, repaired it himself, refused payment, and before leaving said only that if it tripped again tomorrow, they should knock on the door of apartment number 4. After that, it became a habit. During those 3 months, Emmett's family ate downstairs in that apartment more often than they ate in their own. Hollis never asked where they had come from, never asked what Emmett's father did for a living, and never asked why a 14-year-old boy wasn't attending school. He only asked Emmett whether he wanted to learn how to splice wires. Emmett said Hollis taught him how to strip the insulation, how to twist the conductors together, and how to recognize a careless connection simply by touching it to see whether it felt warm. He told Emmett that a loose connection might not catch fire until 3 years later, and when it finally did, people blamed bad luck because no one remembered the hand that had made it. Adeline stood against the wall with her arms folded across her chest, and she hadn't said a word from the moment he began. Emmett said that on the last day, when the car arrived to take his family away, he went down to the 2nd floor to say goodbye. Her father was eating dinner. He stood, shook Emmett's hand as though shaking the hand of a grown man, and Emmett told him that someday, somehow, he would repay him. Hollis Kerrigan shook his head. He said, "You don't owe me. You owe the next person who needs help." Emmett stopped there for a long time. Then he continued, his voice lower now. He said that during those 3 months, there had been a 7-year-old little girl who sat on the steps and watched him work. She sat there every day, never saying much, only watching. The day before he left, he took a length of copper wire left over in her father's toolbox, sat on the steps all afternoon braiding it, and gave it to the little girl just as the car arrived to take him away. He said he couldn't remember what he had told her when he handed it to her. He only remembered that she had taken it in both hands. Adeline looked down at her left wrist. She remained silent for a very long time, so long that they could clearly hear a car passing on the street below. Then she asked him a single question, and it wasn't the one he had expected. She asked why he had never come back. Emmett didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the step beneath his feet, then said that he had come back, but he had come back too late. Adeline was about to ask how late was too late when, at that exact moment and for no reason at all, a fragment of memory she had believed was no longer inside her suddenly broke open in her mind, so clear that she could even hear the voice. A large hand resting against her tiny wrist, tightening the bracelet by one more turn, and a man's voice telling her never to take it off, not even when she went to sleep. Adeline asked again how late was too late, and this time Emmett didn't evade the question. He reached inside his coat and took out a sheet of paper, whose edges had yellowed with age, folded into quarters so many times that the creases had worn into white lines. the kind of wear left on a piece of paper that had been opened and folded again hundreds of times over the years. He handed it to her without saying anything. Adeline unfolded it beneath the hallway light. It was a copy of a list bearing the name of the Boston Fire Department at the top and a date from 20 years earlier, with names arranged below according to apartment number. Her eyes moved down to the entry for apartment number 4. Hollis Kerrigan, 39 years old. Maureen Brannock Kerrigan, 36 years old. Adeline Kerrigan, 19 years earlier. She read her own name on the list of those who hadn't made it out of the building that night. Emmett said he had found this copy when he was 22, after spending 4 years asking questions and paying people who knew how to locate old records. He said he had believed it for 20 years. He said he had paid the rent on this apartment ever since that year. Not because he was waiting for anyone, but because he couldn't bear the thought of someone else moving in, cooking meals there, or pasting new wallpaper over the marks on the kitchen doorframe. Adeline couldn't speak. She folded the paper along its old creases, and she noticed that her hands were doing it very carefully, as though being careful with the paper might spare her from having to think. The next morning, she didn't go home to sleep. She went straight to the city archives, stood in line from the moment the doors opened, and sat there for nearly 4 hours, with an archivist patient enough to search 3 different systems for her. Piece by piece, the story of what had happened 20 years earlier came together before her eyes. That night, the rescue crew had carried a child out of the 2nd floor before the fire spread upward. The child was taken directly to a children's hospital south of the city that same night, before the fire department had even compiled its preliminary list the following morning. She couldn't say her name for the first 2 days. A health insurance card bearing her mother's name was found in her coat pocket, and her foster care intake record was created under the only name they had, Brannock. From there, she passed through 4 foster homes, 4 schools, and 4 sets of records, all of them bearing her mother's last name. The fire department's list was never corrected, because correcting it wasn't anyone's responsibility, because the hospital didn't send names to the fire department, and the fire department didn't ask the foster care system, because those 2 systems had never spoken to each other and had no reason to. It wasn't until Adeline was 18, when she applied for replacement documents so she could find work, that she reclaimed her father's last name. The archivist pushed 2 files toward her, placed them side by side, and told her in the voice of someone who had done this work for many years that this sort of thing wasn't as rare as she might think. Adeline sat looking at her own 2 names on 2 separate sheets of paper dated 10 years apart, and she understood that for 20 years she had been a name filed in the wrong place within 2 systems that had never met. The man who had searched for her all those years had looked for the right name. It was simply that the name had been placed in the column for those who hadn't made it out. She asked for copies. The archivist made 2 for her, and charged her $1.20. On her way to work the night shift that evening, Adeline stopped in the employee area, opened her locker, and placed 1 copy inside beneath her spare gloves, exactly as she had stored every important document for the past 4 years. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Adeline went up to the 5th floor with a still warm egg sandwich in her hand, and when she pushed open the door to Corey's room, his bed was empty. The sheets had been changed, pulled smooth and tight, with the corners neatly folded. The wheelchair was no longer in the corner. The plastic cup bearing the logo of his favorite sports team, the one he always kept on the bedside table, was gone too. Adeline stood in the doorway, and for the first 3 seconds, she couldn't think at all. Her mind was literally blank, and then a lifetime of bad news came crashing over her all at once. She ran into the hallway and questioned the first person she saw, her voice breaking so badly that the woman had to ask her to repeat herself. A young nurse hurriedly checked the computer and said that patient Kerrigan had been transferred at 5 o'clock that morning. All the paperwork was complete. A specialized transport vehicle had picked him up, and he had been taken to Fairbrook Orthopedic Center. Adeline asked who had signed the authorization. The nurse said Corey's attending physician had approved the transfer, that the receiving physician was the head of spinal surgery at Fairbrook, and then added brightly that this was good news, miss, because they performed more surgeries like her brothers than anyone else in the state. Adeline walked farther down the hallway, stopped beside a window, and called Emmett Vasari. He answered after 1 ring. She heard her own voice come out and didn't recognize it. It wasn't the voice she had used with the 2 men in the parking lot, wasn't the voice she used with the head nurse, and wasn't the voice she had spent 27 years using to hold everything in place. She asked, "Where is my brother?" He said Corey was at Fairbrook, that he had been admitted at 6 o'clock, and that everything was fine. She said, I'm going there right now, and so are you." 40 minutes later, they stood facing each other in the parking lot outside Fairbrook, and Adeline told him he had gone behind her back. Emmett said he had done it in front of the doctors, that the records bore signatures from both hospitals, and that there was nothing underhanded about it. She said that wasn't what she was asking. He fell silent. She continued, and this time she made no effort to control her voice. She said, "I gave you 3 conditions in that parking lot. You nodded 3 times, and in less than 2 weeks, you crossed every one of them. Do you know why I'm angry? It isn't because of the money. It's because I stood in the doorway of that room this morning and thought my brother was dead. For exactly 15 seconds, I thought my brother was dead, and you can never give me those 15 seconds back." Emmett stood motionless and listened to every word. He didn't argue once. Then he said, "I am sorry." And Malachi Doyle, standing several steps away, had to turn his face aside, because in 30 years, he had never heard this man say those 3 words to anyone. Adeline asked why he always had to do things this way. Emmett looked down at the pavement for a long time. Then he told her the first honest truth he had spoken since they met. He said that throughout his entire life, he had learned only one way to keep something from disappearing, and that was to buy it, pay for it, or put his hand on it before someone else could. He said he didn't know how to help a person without buying that person. Then he raised his eyes to hers and said, "Teach me how." That afternoon, Adeline sat beside her brother's bed at Fairbrook, and Corey didn't ask where the money had come from. He simply lay on his side with his phone in his hand, and after a while he said, "Sis, that name you just mentioned. Read it to me again." Adeline repeated it. Corey typed it into the search bar, and his expression changed before he said another word. He read the results aloud to her, one line at a time, his voice growing quieter with each one. He read the name of a transportation company, the names of 2 warehouse companies at the harbor, and the name of an office building on Congress Street. He read an article from 4 years earlier about all loading and unloading operations at 3 eastern docks being halted for a day and a half, without any government agency explaining why. He read another, shorter article containing a sentence that said people called the Vasari family the only thing in Boston that didn't need anyone's permission. He stopped when he reached the 5th line, looked up at his sister, and asked whether she knew who that man was. Adeline said she knew half of it. She stayed another 10 minutes, told him that the egg sandwiches had sold out that day, reminded him to finish his dinner, kissed his forehead, and left. When she reached the lobby, she didn't call a car or go to the bus stop. She walked. Fairbrook was 18 blocks from Dorchester, and she walked all 18 of them with both hands in her coat pockets, unable to think of anything clearly except one sentence that kept repeating in her mind. She had sat in that man's car, accepted a job from that man, and stood inside her parents' home, whose rent that man had paid for 20 years. At 9 o'clock that night, she called him and said she wanted to meet. They sat in apartment number 4, on 2 chairs she had cleaned the week before, and she didn't waste time. She asked what he did for a living. Emmett didn't ask why she wanted to know. He said his family controlled most of the transportation and warehousing operations at Boston Harbor, along with certain other things that came with them. He said his father had built the operation beginning in the 70s. His grandfather had laid the foundation before that, and he had taken over when he was 23 because there had been no one else to take over. He said some parts of his business appeared in the books and others didn't, and he had no intention of pretending that the part kept out of the books was a small one. He said all of this in an even voice, without defending himself once or adding a single word to make it sound less severe. Adeline listened to everything. Then she asked her final question. She asked whether his hands were clean. Emmett looked at her for a long time. In the hallway, water could be heard running through the pipes. Then he said there were men who had once sat across from him at a table and had never made it home afterward. He said he hadn't always been the one who made that decision, but he had been there, and he hadn't stopped it. He said, "I won't answer your question with a lie, so I won't answer it." Adeline nodded. She stood, picked up her coat, and said, "I need to go home." He didn't try to stop her. He rose with her and walked her as far as the staircase, and once again, he didn't step beyond the final stair. When Adeline returned to her apartment in Dorchester that night, she did something she had never done in all 4 years she had lived there. She locked her bedroom door from the inside. 3 days later, Adeline was replacing the old lock on apartment number 4 when someone knocked at the door, and the person standing in the hallway was a woman of about 65, whom she had never met but recognized at once, because she had seen those eyes on another face. Ginevra Vasari didn't wait to be invited inside. She stepped past Adeline and walked through the apartment very slowly, touching nothing, both hands gripping the strap of her handbag. She lingered longest in the kitchen doorway. Adeline didn't know whether she had noticed the 2 pencil marks, but she stood there long enough. Then she turned, placed her handbag on the table, and remained standing even after Adeline pulled out a chair for her. She said she had come because her son had canceled 3 meetings in 2 weeks, abandoned a trip to Montreal that had taken 4 months to arrange, and begun allowing other people to see him hesitate, and in her family's world, a man who hesitated was a man who had begun to lose. She said she knew whose daughter Adeline was. She said she remembered those 3 months in this building more clearly than Adeline might think. Then she opened her handbag, took out a check that had already been signed, and pushed it across the kitchen table toward Adeline. She said, "My son is repaying a debt to a memory, not to you. He doesn't see you. He sees a 7-year-old girl sitting on the steps, and a man who showed my family kindness when no one else showed us any at all. When he finishes repaying that debt, and he will finish, you will be the one left over, and there is nowhere for someone left over to stand in this family." Adeline looked at the check for exactly half a second, and then looked away. She didn't pick it up, didn't turn it over, and didn't ask how much it was for. She walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, poured a glass of water, and set it in front of the woman who remained standing. She said, "Please have some water. It's 4 floors up here. I know that's tiring." Ginevra didn't touch the water, but neither could she immediately find another word to say. Adeline wiped her hands on her apron before she spoke again. She said, "You're right about one thing. Your son is repaying a debt. My father gave your family a place to stay for 3 months and repaired your electricity without charging you, and as far as I know, he never accepted a single cent from your family. If you want to repay that debt, please don't repay it with the thing your family has more of than anything else, because that was the one thing my father refused." Ginevra Vasari stood motionless. She was a woman who had spent 30 years sitting through dinners where every sentence was a move in a game. She had pushed far more than a check across far more tables than this kitchen table, and she wasn't accustomed to being answered with a glass of plain water. She looked at Adeline for a long time, and something in her gaze shifted ever so slightly that anyone who wasn't paying attention would have missed it. Then she picked up the check, folded it in half, and returned it to her handbag. She said, "Don't misunderstand me. I haven't changed my mind about you." She walked to the door, stopped at the threshold, and without turning around, added that Adeline's father had been the only person in the building who hadn't asked where they had come from, and then she said, "I never once thanked him properly." Then she left. The glass of water remained untouched on the table. Adeline stood looking at it for a moment, then returned to the lock she had left half dismantled, because she still had to finish the job before 9 o'clock if she wanted to make it to her night shift on time. That weekend, an elderly man waited for Adeline at the cafe on the corner of Holloway Street, and when he saw her walk in, he rose to his feet, truly rose, pulling out her chair with both hands the way men did in another age. He introduced himself as Bastien Farrow, and said he had worked beside Emmett's father for more than 30 years, and beside Emmett since the boy had still been too short to reach the tabletop. He ordered her a cup of coffee with milk, and asked whether she liked almond pastries, then ordered 2 without waiting for an answer, saying, "I'm sorry. I'm old. I'm not accustomed to letting a woman sit across from me without giving her something to eat." Adeline had prepared herself for a second check, but there was no check. He simply asked about her brother, asked whether the surgery had been scheduled yet, and when she told him it was set for the following week, he said, "Good. Very good, my dear," with the genuine relief of someone who had just heard good news about a child in the family. Then he said he had come for another reason. He said he knew Emmett had shown her the list. He said he had been sitting beside the boy when he was 22 and read her name on it, and the truth was that Emmett had never been the same after that day. He told her about the night of the fire, in the slow voice of a man recounting an old story from the neighborhood. He said that back then, the entire row of buildings on Sumner Hill still had wiring from the 40s, that no one had replaced it in decades, and that the landlord had merely patched things up. He said the investigators had concluded that an electrical short on the 3rd floor had spread downward through the utility shaft, and that the wind had been blowing in the wrong direction that night. He shook his head, looked down into his coffee, and said her father had been a decent electrician. "I mean that," he said. "Everyone in that neighborhood thought highly of him. He repaired things for the entire building without charging anyone. Then he sighed and said, "But decent men tend to take on too much, and when they carry too much, sometimes they become careless. In that line of work, all it takes is one moment of inattention, my dear." Adeline nodded. She took a sip of her coffee. He continued talking for a while about the old neighborhood, about the owner of the shoe store who had closed his shop, and about how hardly anyone lived in that building anymore. Before he stood to leave, he rested his hand on the back of hers for 1 second, exactly 1 second, the way an elderly uncle might at a family memorial gathering, and said that if she ever needed anything she didn't feel comfortable asking Emmett for, she should call him. He paid the entire bill, left a generous tip, and before walking out the door, he turned back and added one more thing, his voice quieter now, almost as though he were speaking to himself. He was a decent electrician, but he was careless. If only he had been a little more careful back then, everything would have been different. Then he left. Adeline remained there alone with 2 untouched almond pastries. She liked him. That had been her first feeling, and she didn't pretend to herself that she hadn't felt it. But something remained lodged across her chest the entire way home, and it wasn't until she stood on the second-floor landing that she finally found a name for it. He had said it twice. The same word, twice, in a conversation where everything else had been said only once. When she reached the apartment, Adeline took out the notebook she used to record her shifts and bus times, turned to a blank page, and wrote down exactly what he had said, sentence by sentence, including both times he had used the word careless. She sat looking at that page for a very long time. She couldn't remember her father's face. She couldn't remember his voice, but she remembered one sentence. The sentence that man had taught a 14-year-old boy in this very kitchen, that a carelessly made connection might not catch fire until 3 years later, and people would blame bad luck, because no one would remember the hand that had made it. On Wednesday night that week, Adeline discovered water leaking beneath the sink. Not much, only enough to darken a long streak across the wood, but it had been leaking long enough for the floorboard beside the base of the cabinet to swell and pull free from its joint at one end. She took the small pry bar from her toolbox and lifted the board, intending to brace it and screw it back into place. And when the board came loose, she saw a box in the hollow underneath. It was a square tin cookie box with a fitted lid, and one side of it was blackened, as though it had been held over a flame and then left to cool. Adeline lowered herself to the floor, with the box resting in her lap. The lid wouldn't open at first. She had to work the tip of a screwdriver around the rim 3 times, and when it finally sprang loose, she heard the sound of her own breathing in the silent kitchen. There was no money inside, no jewelry, nothing people usually hid beneath floorboards. There was only a pocket-sized notebook with a stiff cover and a spine that had come halfway apart. The kind of notebook a workman might tuck into the back pocket of his overalls. Adeline opened the first page. In the upper right corner, the owner's name had been written in ballpoint pen, in evenly slanted capital letters. Hollis Kerrigan. She sat motionless for a very long time before those 2 words. It was the first time in her life she had ever seen her father's handwriting. She turned the page. The notebook was a work ledger, not a journal. Each page covered a single day, listing addresses, jobs, quantities of materials, wages collected, and wages still unpaid. There were many entries marked unpaid. Some pages contained only a single line. Repaired 3rd-floor circuit breaker, no charge. Another read, replaced outlet in Mrs. Pike's room, exchanged for 2 loads of laundry. Adeline turned through the pages one at a time, slowly, and realized she was reading the final year in the life of a man whose face she couldn't remember, reading it through the only thing he had left behind, a list of everything he had done for other people. Then she reached the final pages. There, the handwriting changed. It was no longer even. The letters leaned more sharply. The pen pressed harder, and in places its tip had torn through the paper. The second-to-last page bore a date from 20 years earlier, 3 days before the night of the fire, and it contained no record of work performed or wages earned. It said that the fire alarm system from the 3rd through the 6th floors had been disconnected from its power supply at the utility cabinet in the basement. The line beneath it said it wasn't a malfunction or a blown fuse, but that someone had removed the connection and bypassed it by hand, and whoever had done it knew exactly what they were doing. The line below that recorded the date he discovered it, the time he discovered it, and the precise location of the utility cabinet. Then, at the bottom of the page, framed by 2 squared pen strokes, was a long sequence of numbers preceded by 3 letters, with a maintenance contract number and the name of the company that had signed it written underneath. Adeline read the sequence 3 times. She didn't understand what it meant. She understood only that her father had drawn a box around it, and people boxed something in only when they knew they would need it later. She turned to the next page to read the rest. There was no next page. Close to the spine were 3 jagged remnants of paper, 3 uneven tear lines, ripped out hastily by hand rather than cut. 3 pages. Adeline ran her fingertip along those torn edges again and again, as though if she traced them enough times, the words would reappear. She turned the notebook upside down, shook it, and emptied the entire tin onto the floor. Nothing fell out. She sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet door and the notebook open across her knees, and she remained that way for a very long time. In her mind, the elderly man's voice from the cafe repeated over and over that her father had been a decent electrician, but a careless one. In her hands were 3 pages torn from the notebook of a man who had recorded even the wages paid to him in 2 loads of laundry. Adeline didn't sleep that night. When morning came and the first sunlight touched the edge of the kitchen doorway, she was still sitting in the same place, and she realized she was directly beneath the 2 pencil marks on the doorframe. At 7 o'clock in the morning, Adeline called him and said, "Come up here. This time, you have to come inside." Emmett arrived 30 minutes later. He stopped on the final stair exactly as he had the 2 times before, then looked at her, and then, for the first time in 20 years, he crossed the threshold of apartment number 4. He didn't look around. He went straight into the kitchen because she was already sitting there, and she handed him the notebook without saying a word. He opened the first page. He recognized the handwriting before he had time to read the name, and Adeline saw it. She saw his shoulders sag ever so slightly, and his finger stop at the corner of the page. He turned through it slowly, 1 page at a time, exactly as she had the night before. When he reached the final pages, he stopped completely. He read the second to last page twice. Then he read the sequence of numbers inside the box, and in that moment, Adeline knew he understood what it was, because his face changed, not with surprise, but with the look of a man who had just realized that the thing in his hands was the very thing he had feared for years but had never dared to name. She asked what the sequence meant. Emmett didn't answer right away. He placed the notebook on the table, with his hands resting on either side of it, and said the first 3 letters were the code for a contractor responsible for maintaining electrical and fire protection systems in the city's rental buildings. He said the company didn't bear his family's name, that no one named Vasari appeared on its list of shareholders, but it belonged to his family, had belonged to his family since before he was born, and everyone who needed to know had always known. Adeline asked whether he was certain. He said he had personally approved its budget for 6 consecutive years. She sat in silence. Then he continued, and this time he told her something she hadn't asked. He said that after the night of the fire, his father had dealt with the city personally. He said his father had signed the official, finding that the fire had been caused by an electrical short in the aging system, hadn't objected to a single word, hadn't requested any further investigation, and within the next 4 months had paid every family who had lost someone in that building. Each family had been paid separately, off the books, and each payment had come with a document they were required to sign. Adeline asked what the document said. Emmett said it stated that they accepted the compensation and would make no further claims. He said that when he was 23 and took control of the family operation, he had found the entire stack of those papers in his father's safe, and he had questioned him about them only once. She asked what his father had said. Emmett said his father had told him, "Don't dig any deeper. It's over." Adeline looked down at the open notebook on the table, at the 3 jagged remnants of paper beside the spine, and said, "Then your family caused it." It wasn't a question. She spoke it as a statement, her voice calm, and it was that calmness that left him unable to answer at first. He remained silent for a long time. Then he said he didn't know. He said, with complete honesty, that he didn't know who had disconnected that utility cabinet, didn't know who had given the order, and didn't know whether his father had known or had simply cleaned up the consequences for someone else. But he said he wouldn't use the words "I don't know" to place himself on the innocent side of it. He said the company belonged to his family. Those documents had been given to people by his father to sign, and for 20 years, he had lived on money flowing from that system without ever questioning it again. Then he said one final thing, speaking to the notebook itself rather than looking at her. Those 3 pages were torn out, because there was a name written on them. That evening, a car was parked across Holloway Street, about 100 feet from the entrance to the building, and it was still there when Adeline left for her night shift at 10 o'clock. On the second night, it was there again, parked a few feet farther down. On the third night, she walked past it very slowly and looked straight through the windshield, and the person sitting inside didn't turn away or start the engine. On Wednesday morning, she opened her locker in the airport staff area and saw that one edge of the door had been bent outward in a spot the size of a fingertip. Her spare gloves were still inside. The photocopy she had hidden beneath them was gone. Nothing else was missing, and no one had touched the purse hanging from the hook beside it. Adeline stood looking at the open locker for a long time, then closed it, finished her entire shift, and reported it to no one. That same morning, at a breakfast restaurant on Congress Street, Bastian Farrow sat across from Emmett and said he was worried. He said Sumner Hill was nearly deserted now, that only 2 streetlights still worked at night, and that it wasn't safe for a young woman working the night shift to come home alone there. He said the girl was digging into something that had happened 20 years ago, and 20-year-old matters always had someone who didn't want them dug up. He suggested getting her out of the city for a while. He said he had a house in Vermont, quiet and looked after, and added that he was saying this for the girl's own safety and no other reason. Emmett listened to everything. He nodded and said he would arrange it. Farrow gave his arm a gentle pat before rising, exactly as he had done since Emmett was a boy. That evening, Emmett told Malachi Doyle to change his entire schedule for the next 2 weeks, including his driving routes and the people assigned to guard him, and instructed him not to send the revised schedule to the office. Malachi asked, "Not even Mr. Farrow?" Emmett said, "Not even him." Over the next 4 days, there were no meetings, no raised voices, and no one was summoned, but the 3 most important channels of information in the organization were quietly rerouted, one after another. The daily reports from the harbor began going directly to Emmett's desk instead of passing through the advisor's office. The list of expenditures kept off the books was assigned to someone else for preliminary approval, and the weekly meeting with the legal team, the meeting where Bastian Farrow had occupied the chair to the right for 30 years, was moved that week to a location no one told him about. On Wednesday night, Malachi was driving Emmett home when he looked into the rearview mirror at a red light and said, "You've started keeping things from him." Emmett looked out the window. He said, "I've started listening." Malachi remained silent for 2 blocks, then said, "He held you in his arms before you knew how to walk." Emmett said, "I know. My father trusted him more than he trusted me." Then he added that the 3 pages torn from the notebook couldn't have been removed by an outsider, because an outsider would have taken the entire notebook, and with the whole building burning, there would have been no reason for anyone to tear out only 3 pages. He said only someone who knew exactly what was written on each page would have torn out precisely those 3. Malachi asked nothing more. On the other side of the city, Bastian Farrow remained in his office until nearly midnight, and he made 3 telephone calls. On the first call, he was told that the harbor reports had been sent directly that week and would no longer come to him. On the second, the person hesitated before saying that the meeting with the lawyers had already taken place on Tuesday. On the third, no one answered. He set the telephone down on his desk and sat motionless for a long time in the room, where only a single desk lamp remained lit. For 30 years, he had occupied the chair to the right. He knew exactly what this felt like, because he was the man who had taught the entire organization how to do it to someone else. Then he picked up the telephone again, dialed a number that wasn't stored in his contacts, and when someone answered at the other end, he said only one thing: "The girl cannot be allowed to remember anything. Take whatever she has. Don't touch her." The following Monday, Adeline swiped her badge at the employee entrance, and the indicator light turned red. She swiped it again, still red. The attendant on duty made a call, then told her to go to the contractor's office on the ground floor of Terminal B. There, a human resources manager she had met only twice handed her a notice stating that her access badge had been temporarily suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of an internal investigation. He said that the previous week, inventory had gone missing from supply room number 2 in the basement of Terminal C, 2 crates of equipment that hadn't yet been installed, and the system showed that an employee badge registered to Adeline Kerrigan had opened the supply room door at 2:40 in the morning. He told her it was only procedure and that she shouldn't worry, but he said it while placing a notice he had already printed in front of her along with a pen for her to sign, acknowledging receipt. Adeline read it from beginning to end, then signed it. She walked out into the corridor, stood beside the glass doors, and took out her phone. She opened her contacts, stopped at Emmett Vasari's name, stared at it for a few seconds, then turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into her pocket, because she knew exactly what would happen if she called. Someone would call someone else. Her badge would be working again by that afternoon, and for the rest of her life at that airport, she would be the woman no one dared touch and no one believed was innocent. She went back into the office and requested 3 things, writing them down on a sheet of paper and asking the manager to sign an acknowledgement that he had received the request. First, her timesheet for that night. Second, the security footage from the employee parking lot entrance. Third, the security footage from the corridor outside supply room number 2. The manager said the first 2 would be possible, but the third would have to be requested from airport security. Adeline said, "Then please request it for me. Today." 2 days later, they sat together in a small room with a monitor. The timesheet showed that Adeline hadn't been scheduled to work that night. She produced an admission record from Fairbrook Medical Center, stamped and showing clearly that she had entered at 11:20 that night and left at 5:10 the next morning, because it was the night before Corey's surgery and she had remained there the entire time. The parking lot footage showed no sign of her bicycle, no glimpse of her, nothing at all. The manager's voice began to grow quieter. Then they played the third recording. On the black and white screen, a man walked down the basement corridor wearing a cleaning contractor's jacket and a baseball cap. He stopped at the supply room door, held a badge to the reader, and the door opened. The entire thing took 9 seconds. He never raised his face once because he knew where the camera was. But at the 7th second, as he turned to push open the door, the brim of his cap lifted slightly, and the overhead light fell directly across one side of his face. Adeline leaned closer to the screen. She asked them to rewind it, then to rewind it again. Then she sat upright and remained completely still for so long that the manager had to ask whether she recognized the man. Adeline said she did. She said that the previous week, in the corridor connecting terminals B and C, a man walking in the opposite direction had bumped into her shoulder. He had apologized very politely, bent down to pick up the spray bottle she had dropped, asked whether she was all right, and then continued on his way. She said that at the time, she had thought only one thing, that he had bumped into the shoulder where she wore her badge. She said she had checked immediately, and the badge was still attached to its lanyard, so she had forgotten the incident entirely. The manager asked what she thought the man had done. Adeline looked at the black and white face frozen on the screen and said, "He didn't take my badge. He only needed to look at it long enough to read the sequence of numbers on the back." Adeline's badge was reactivated on Friday afternoon, accompanied by a 3-line notice stating that the internal investigation had found no evidence of her involvement. No one apologized. She carried the notice outside, and she felt no relief at all, because during the 2 days she had spent sitting in that room with the monitor, she had come to understand something no one had told her. The man in the footage hadn't stolen anything from her. He had merely taken away the only thing she had, her job, and he had done it on the one night she couldn't possibly have been at the airport, the night before her brother's surgery, the night anyone who had watched her for a week could have anticipated. That evening, she called Emmett and said she wanted to meet him at apartment number 4. He came. This time, he stepped inside immediately, without stopping on the final stair. Adeline stood in the middle of the kitchen rather than sitting down, and she told him everything from the beginning in the same calm, concise voice she had used with the human resources manager. She told him about her locker being forced open, about the car parked outside the building for 3 consecutive nights, about the man who had bumped into the shoulder where she wore her badge, about the 9 seconds captured on the recording. Emmett listened to all of it, and Adeline saw his jaw tighten when she reached the end. He said he would find the man. She said, "I know you will." Then she continued, and her voice still didn't rise. She said, "The question isn't whether you'll find him. The question is that for the past 2 weeks, every time something has happened to me, I've had to sit down and ask myself where it came from. And there's only one thing on that list, your world." She said, "My father recorded even the wages he was paid in 2 loads of laundry, and the last 3 pages of his notebook were torn out. The utility cabinet was disconnected by hand that night, and the company responsible for maintaining it belonged to your family. Your father signed a finding that called it an accident, then went from family to family, paying them to sign papers that would keep them silent. And now, 20 years later, when I find a notebook beneath my kitchen floor, within 10 days I'm followed. My locker is forced open. My badge is copied. And I nearly lose my job. Emmett said, "You think it was me?" Adeline shook her head. She said, "No, I've thought about it long enough to know it wasn't you." Then she said the words she had spent the entire afternoon preparing. And once she had spoken them, she felt an empty space open inside her chest. "I'm not asking whether you ordered it. I'm asking whether your world did it." Emmett stood motionless. He couldn't say a word. Adeline nodded and said, "Yes, there, that's the answer." She said, "You haven't lied to me once these past few weeks, and I'm grateful for that. But I just asked you a question you couldn't answer with no, and I can't live in a place where that question has no answer." She slipped a hand into her coat pocket, took out the tarnished brass key, and placed it on the kitchen table directly beneath the 2 pencil marks on the doorframe. Emmett looked at the key and asked, "Where are you going?" She said, "Home, to work my shifts, to go to the hospital with my brother, to live exactly as I did before you walked up to me in that corridor." He said, "What about the debt?" She said, "It's still in my name, and I'll still pay it, $300 a week, exactly as I told you in the parking lot." He didn't try to stop her. He asked only one question, quietly, almost too softly to be heard. "What about the bracelet?" Adeline stopped at the threshold. She raised her hand to her left wrist and kept it there. She said, "I'm not giving this back. It belonged to me before I knew who you were, and it will still belong to me after I walk out this door." Then she looked at him one last time and said, "If I ever come back, it has to be because I choose you. Not because I have nowhere else to go." For the next 9 days, Adeline lived exactly as she had said she would. She worked her night shifts, went to Fairbrook every morning, and paid $300 on Friday. Corey had made it through surgery and was learning to sit up without help, and every time he managed it, he asked, "Did you call him today?" And every time, Adeline said no. On the 10th night, she boarded the Route 11 bus at 9:45 and sat in the 3rd seat from the back, where she always sat. There were only 4 people on the bus. It crossed the bridge, its wheels thudding over the seams in the concrete, and out of a habit 20 years old, she reached up and twisted the bracelet around her left wrist. The wire broke. It made no sound at all. There was only the faintest sensation of something loosening around her wrist, and by the time she looked down, it had already slipped from her hand. The copper wire fell into her lap. The metal tag did not. It dropped to the floor of the bus, bounced once, and slid forward with the momentum of the bus climbing the incline. Adeline sprang from her seat and dropped to her knees on the floor, sweeping both hands through the darkness beneath the rows of seats. The woman sitting ahead of her lifted her feet to help. Adeline found it beside the base of a stainless steel pole, and when she picked it up, it was no longer a single piece. The impact had split it open along one edge, and in her hand were 2 thin layers of metal separated from each other. The outer layer was the tag she had looked at every day for 20 years. The inner layer was slightly smaller and far brighter, because it had never been exposed to the air. Adeline sat down on the floor of the bus between the 2 rows of seats. She tilted the inner piece of metal toward the overhead light. There were characters on its surface, not written but engraved. The lines fine and deep, the kind made with a steel awl and a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. 3 letters came first, then a sequence of numbers. Nothing else. No name, no date, not a single word of explanation. She read it. Then she read it again. She understood none of it. She had braced herself for a name, a message, anything that belonged to a human being. And what lay in her hand was as cold and mute as a number printed on a receipt. The driver called back to ask whether she was all right. Adeline said she was fine. She stood, returned to her seat, and sat there with the 2 pieces of metal in her palm and the broken copper wire draped across her fingers. The bus passed 3 stops without her looking out the window once. Then the memory returned. The only memory of her father she had recovered in the 2nd-floor hallway on the night she learned about that summer. A large hand resting on her tiny wrist, the bracelet being tightened by one more turn, and that voice, the voice of the man whose face she couldn't remember, telling her never to take it off, not even when she went to sleep. Adeline sat very still, because only now did she hear those words differently. That wasn't something a father said when giving his daughter a gift. No one gave such an instruction to a 7-year-old child about a strand of copper wire braided by the boy next door. A person said something like that when he had hidden something inside it. She remembered the faint rattling sound she had heard 1,000 times at the sink, on the bus, while mopping the airport floor at 4 o'clock in the morning. The dry little clicking she had always assumed came from the tag striking one of the links. It hadn't been striking the links. For 20 years, the thing making that sound had been the second piece of metal hidden inside. Her father had slipped it in before returning the bracelet to her, perhaps on the very night he sat down and wrote the final lines in his notebook, and he had chosen the only hiding place no one would ever search, the wrist of his 8-year-old daughter. Then he had told her never to take it off, and she never had. For 20 years, through 4 foster homes, 4 schools, 2 different last names, and 1 fire, that child had kept her word. Adeline closed her hand around it. The bus stopped at her station. The doors opened, then closed, and the bus pulled away again, while she remained sitting in the 3rd seat from the back. Adeline rode the bus all the way to the end of the route, got off at the final stop, then caught the bus going back toward Sumner Hill. She didn't know what she was looking for. She knew only that the 3 letters on the piece of metal weren't the code for a contracting company, that they didn't resemble the sequence of numbers inside the box in the notebook, and that her father had hidden it in the place he trusted most, so it had to lead to another place he trusted. She walked along Holloway Street at nearly 11 o'clock at night. 2 streetlights were still burning, exactly as the older man at the diner had said. Most of the shops had been closed for years, their signs still hanging above windows covered with paper. Only one place still had its lights on, a laundry shop on the corner with a wooden sign whose lettering had nearly faded away. Adeline looked at the 3 letters engraved on the piece of metal in her palm, then she looked at the sign again. She stood outside on the sidewalk for a long time before pushing open the door. Inside, a woman of about 70 was ironing clothes with her sleeves rolled up, and without looking up, she said, "I close at 11. If you're dropping something off, you can pick it up tomorrow." Adeline said, "I'm not dropping anything off." She walked to the counter, placed the piece of metal on the wooden surface, and pushed it toward her. The woman glanced down and started to say something else, then stopped. She set the iron on its stand. She wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the piece of metal, turned it toward the light, and stared at it for so long that Adeline could hear steam hissing from the iron behind her. Then she set it down and asked whose daughter she was. Adeline said, "I'm Hollis Kerrigan's daughter." The woman said nothing. She stood there with both hands braced against the counter, her head slightly bowed, and released a long breath that Adeline didn't know how to understand. Then she walked to the door, locked it, and turned the sign to closed, though it was only 5 minutes to 11. She came back and said her name was Lorna Pike. She said she had been on that corner for 42 years. She said Adeline's father had repaired the wiring in her shop without charging her, and she had done his family's laundry without charging him, and that was how the 2 households had lived beside each other for more than 10 years. Then she said that 3 days before that night, he had brought a box over to her. Adeline couldn't speak. "Mrs. Pike continued in an even voice, as though she were telling a story she had repeated in her mind many times but had never once spoken aloud. She said he had come in near closing time, at almost this exact hour, and asked whether the storage room in the back could still be locked. She told him it could. He set the box down, secured it with his own lock, handed her the key, and said, "Mrs. Pike, if my little girl grows up and brings this exact number here, please open it for her." She said she asked him what number he meant, and he told her she would know it when she saw it. She said she asked why he didn't keep the box at home, and he only smiled and said, "There have been too many people coming and going through my home lately." Adeline asked whether she had ever opened it to look inside. "Mrs. Pike looked at her and said, "I've never opened it. I've had the key for 20 years, and I've never opened it once. You can believe me or not," she said. 3 days later, the building burned, and I stood on this corner all night. The next morning, they read out the names on the list, and I heard yours among them. From that day on, I didn't know what to do with the box. 3 times, I meant to take it to the police station, and all 3 times, I turned around and came back, because he didn't tell me to give it to the police. He told me to open it for his little girl. People say my mind is going. My son tells me, "Mom, throw it away. Why are you keeping a dead man's box?" Adeline asked. "Then why did you keep it?" Mrs. Pike took the ring of keys hanging from a nail behind the counter and said, "Because I promised." She went ahead, leading Adeline behind the plastic curtain, past 2 silent dryers, and toward a wooden door at the very back. She slipped the key into the lock, then her hand stopped before turning it. and without looking back at Adeline, she said, "I've waited for you so long that sometimes I thought I had remembered it wrong." The box was a metal toolbox with a carrying handle, its blue paint chipped away, and Mrs. Lorna had to use both hands to lift it onto the ironing table. The lock opened easily. Inside, the first thing on top was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and when Adeline unfolded it, she found 3 pages with jagged edges, 3 uneven lines where they had been torn out by hand. She took the notebook from her bag and placed it beside them, and the 3 ragged edges fit together like 2 halves of something that had been broken apart. She read, those 3 pages were the last 3 pages her father had written in his life, and they were unlike any of the pages before them because they didn't record jobs or wages. They recorded what he had discovered. On the first page, he listed 11 addresses of rental buildings maintained by that contracting company, and beside each address were 2 figures, one marked as the amount approved for expenditure, the other as the amount actually spent on the work. On 8 of the 11 lines, the 2 figures were very far apart. On the second page, he wrote that he had personally inspected 6 of those buildings, that the materials listed in the records had never been installed, that the fire alarm systems in 4 of the buildings hadn't been replaced since the previous owner's time, and that at 41 Holloway Street in particular, the record stated that every detector and the entire control panel had been replaced 2 years earlier, while he himself had stood in the basement, staring directly at a panel that had never once been removed from the wall. The third page was the shortest of all. He wrote that he had made contact with the elder Mr. Vasari and would meet him on Saturday evening, that he would bring everything with him, and that if he failed to make the meeting, then everything was at Mrs. Pike's place. On the final line, written smaller and slanting slightly toward the edge of the page, he wrote that he wasn't doing this to hurt anyone. He was doing it because everyone in that building slept beneath a dead electrical panel. Beneath the papers was a thick stack of documents held together by a rusted metal clip. They were payment orders and material approval forms, the originals, each bearing an official stamp, and every page carried a signature in the lower right corner. Adeline went through the entire stack, and the signature on every document was the same: slanted handwriting, an oversized first letter, and a long trailing stroke. She didn't have to guess the name. On 3 of the pages, it was typed in full on the line, identifying the person who had authorized the payment: Bastien Farrow. At the very bottom, inside a cloth pouch, was a small audio cassette, the kind used in handheld recorders by tradesmen who needed to dictate measurements while both hands were occupied. Mrs. Lorna looked at it, then went into the back and searched through a cabinet behind the counter for quite some time, before returning with an old machine. She said it had belonged to her son when he was in school. She said she didn't know whether it still worked. It did. The recording carried the sound of wind, cars moving along the street, a metal door closing, and then the voices of 2 men. The first was a voice Adeline had never heard in her life, and recognized immediately, the voice of a man who spoke slowly and quietly, using very simple words. He said he didn't want to make a big thing of it. He said he only needed to know that those buildings would be properly equipped, and after that he wouldn't keep anything. He would give it all to Mr. Vasari, and that would be the end of it. The second voice was warm and courteous, and Adeline had sat drinking coffee with that voice not long ago. It said that he understood completely, that Hollis was a decent man, and it was precisely because he was a decent man that he was sitting there with him, instead of someone else. Then the voice said, "Mr. Kerrigan, you know there are some doors that can't be closed once they've been opened, and you have a family. You have a little girl. You should think very carefully about whether you want to be the man who opens one." The other man was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "I've thought it through." The tape continued for another 20 seconds, with nothing but the sound of wind, and then it ended. Adeline sat motionless. Mrs. Lorna stood behind her with one hand resting on the back of the chair. In Adeline's mind, 3 things arranged themselves into place. The first was that the man in the diner had twice said her father had been careless, and he had said it to someone he believed could never contradict him. The second was that he had said it with genuine pity in his voice, because for 20 years he had never needed to lie about this to anyone. For 20 years, he had believed that the only person who could reveal the hiding place had already been named on that list. The third was that these 3 pages had been torn from the notebook, which meant that on the night of the fire, someone had entered apartment number 4 before the flames reached it, opened the correct drawer, found the correct notebook, torn out the correct 3 pages, and walked away. And that person had left believing he now held everything Hollis Kerrigan had left behind. Adeline called Emmett from the laundry shop at nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, and all she said was, "I want to see your lawyer, not you." 4 hours later, in an office on Congress Street, all 3 pages, the entire stack of payment orders, and the recording were copied, numbered, documented, and sealed, with Mrs. Lorna Pike's signature entered under custodian. Emmett read everything from beginning to end, without skipping a single page. He read most slowly when he reached the 3 documents bearing the fully typed name. Then he listened to the recording, and he listened to it twice, and the second time, he closed his eyes when the warm voice said, "You're a decent man, and that's precisely why I'm sitting here with you." When the recording ended, he sat motionless for a very long time. Then he told the lawyer that the entire file would be sent to the federal prosecutor's office, complete, with nothing removed, including the documents bearing his father's signature, including those bearing his own signature from 6 years of approving budgets. He said, "You keep it. If I haven't called you again by 6 o'clock this morning, send it." The lawyer asked once more to be certain. Emmett said, "I won't say it again." When he reached the parking lot, Malachi Doyle was waiting beside the car door, and he said, "You know that file won't bury only him." Emmett said, "I know." Malachi said, "It'll bury you too. It'll bury your entire family, the contracting company, all 6 years of your signatures. You're cutting off your own hand." Emmett opened the car door, then stopped, and he said, "I'm repaying a debt to the next person who needs help." Malachi looked at him for a long moment, then got into the car and said nothing for the entire drive. That same night, at warehouse number 7 on the eastern waterfront, Bastian Farrow had summoned all 11 men. He sat at the head of the table, in the place where he had never sat in 30 years, because that place wasn't his. He spoke in the sorrowful voice of a man being forced to do something he didn't want to do. He said, "You've all seen what's happened over the past 4 weeks. A trip to Montreal was canceled, 3 meetings were postponed, reports were withheld, and the people inside this family weren't allowed to know the schedule of their own leader." He said, "I carried that boy in my arms before he could walk, and it pains me to say this, but a man who allows a woman to change him this way is no longer fit to hold that seat." Chairs shifted. Several men nodded. Farrow said, "I propose a vote." At that exact moment, the iron door at the far end of the warehouse opened. It wasn't Emmett who walked in. It was a 27-year-old woman wearing an old coat and work shoes, carrying a canvas bag in one hand. No one in the room knew who she was except the man sitting at the head of the table. Adeline walked straight to the table without looking at anyone, and she placed 3 pages with jagged edges, a stack of documents bound by a rusted metal clip, and an old tape recorder on its surface. Farrow rose to his feet. He said, "Young lady, this isn't your place." Adeline said, "I didn't come here for revenge." She said, "I came to give my father his name back." Then she pressed the button. Inside warehouse number 7, among 11 men accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed, no one spoke for 4 full minutes. There was wind on the recording. There was the sound of a metal door closing. Then came the voices of 2 men, one speaking slowly and saying that all he wanted was for those buildings to be properly equipped, and the other warm and courteous, a voice every man in that room had heard thousands of times in his life, speaking about doors that couldn't be closed once they had been opened. The man sitting beside Farrow turned to look at him. Then the next man did the same. Then the entire row of chairs on the left. The recording reached its end, clicked once, and stopped on its own. Adeline pushed the documents into the middle of the table and said, 3 of them bear his full name. You can look for yourselves. No one reached out to take them. No one needed to. Bastian Farrow was still standing with one hand braced against the table, and he opened his mouth to speak. In 30 years, he had never once opened his mouth without someone listening. This time, someone listened too. The man at the far end of the table said, "Sit down." Farrow looked slowly around the room, studying one face after another, and he realized that the chair he had occupied only moments earlier was no longer beneath him. The iron door opened for the second time. Emmett walked in, approached the head of the table, and never looked at Farrow once. He took out his phone, dialed a number, waited through 2 rings, and spoke exactly 2 words. "Send it." The file reached the federal prosecutor's office at 9 o'clock that morning. and everything that followed unfolded slowly, in the manner of paperwork rather than motion pictures, stretching across 14 months, 3 rounds of subpoenas, and 41 interrogations. Emmett Vasari sat on the cooperating witnesses' side through all 41 of them, including the sessions when they questioned him about his own signatures, and not once did he say he hadn't known. 4 months after the night at warehouse number 7, Corey Kerrigan managed to stand. He did it on a Tuesday morning in the rehabilitation room at Fairbrook, his hands gripping 2 crutches, his legs trembling violently, and he held himself upright for 19 seconds before he had to sit down. Adeline was standing in the doorway. He saw his sister and smiled first, just as he always did. But this time, Adeline couldn't read anything behind that smile, because this time, there was nothing behind it that needed to be hidden. He said, 19 seconds, Addie, and he said it in the voice of a 19-year-old boy who had just won something. What remained of the Vasari family's unfrozen assets, after all required repayments had been deducted, was transferred into a fund administered by an independent board. The fund provided scholarships for vocational training in the electrical and technical trades to young people who had grown up in foster care, giving priority to Sumner Hill and the surrounding neighborhoods, and it bore the name Hollis Kerrigan. The first notice announcing the fund was printed on a Saturday morning, and the first person to tape it to a glass door was Mrs. Lorna Pike. She used clear tape and hung it slightly crooked, and she refused to let anyone straighten it. She said people could still read it that way. 1 week later, Ginevra Vasari came to the diner on Bennington Street, just as Adeline's shift ended. She wasn't carrying the large handbag she had brought the last time. She sat at the final table beside the window, and this time, when Adeline pulled out the chair, she sat down immediately instead of remaining on her feet. She said, "I didn't come to apologize because I don't believe my apology would be worth anything to you." Then she placed a small object wrapped in a handkerchief on the table. Adeline opened it. It was a carpenter's pencil, the flat kind, its red body faded, one end worn almost completely away and the other marked by teeth. Ginevra said, "Your father used this." She said, "That evening, he told the 2 children to stand against the kitchen doorframe, my boy in front and his little girl behind him, and he drew 2 marks and wrote their names beside them." She said, "He left it on the table, and my family left the next morning. I picked it up intending to return it. Then I put it in my pocket, and then I kept it for 20 years. Adeline asked why she hadn't given it to Emmett. Ginevra was silent for a moment. She said, "Because if I gave it to him, I would have had to tell him the other things too." She said, "After the night of the fire, my husband came home near dawn and sat in the kitchen without turning on the light, and I asked him one question." She said, "He answered me by saying, 'Don't ask anything else,'" she said, "and I didn't ask again. Not for 20 years, and every time I thought about asking, I reminded myself that I still had a son to raise." She looked out the window and said, "I owed your father for 20 years, and I repaid that debt with the worst thing a person can offer as payment: silence." Then she stood, fastened the button of her coat, and before she left, she added one more thing without looking at Adeline. She said, after he drew that lower mark, he turned to me and said that by the following year, his little girl would be 1 finger joint taller than that. She said, he sounded so certain, as if he had already seen it happen. Adeline remained sitting alone with the carpenter's pencil in her palm, and beyond the window, the Route 11 bus had just gone by. 1 year later, at 4:15 in the morning, Terminal C at Logan Airport was as empty as it was every night at that hour. But the woman standing in the middle of the corridor no longer held a mop. Adeline Kerrigan wore the jacket of the night shift supervisory team and carried an assignment board in one hand. She was turning the area over to the morning crew and reminding the new employee that the restroom at the far end of the corridor had to be cleaned before 6 o'clock because the first flight would land at 6:10. She heard footsteps behind her, 2 paces away, and then they stopped. A man asked her which way led to the private aircraft terminal. Adeline didn't look up from the assignment board. She said, "That depends on whether you want to leave or whether you want to stay." The man didn't answer. He stepped forward, placed something on the supply cart beside her, then retreated to exactly where he had been standing. It was a newly woven copper cord, its braids perfectly even like the work of a craftsman's hands, with an empty space left in the center where nothing had yet been attached. Adeline looked at it for a long time. Emmett said, "I thought that this time you should engrave the name yourself." She picked up the cord, turned it once in her hand, then raised her eyes to him for the first time that night and said, "Then you'll have to wait. I still have 15 minutes before my shift ends," he said. "I can wait. I've already waited 20 years. There are debts in this world that can't be repaid with money, only by choosing once more to treat the person standing before you with kindness." A poor electrician from that working-class neighborhood never knew that the kindness he had given over the course of 3 months to a family of strangers hiding under another name would travel in a circle for 20 years and return at exactly the right moment to save his own daughter. And the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, no matter how many pages are torn away, how carefully it's spoken around, or how thoroughly it's replaced by a single word like careless, remains where it is, waiting only for someone brave enough to open the door. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you once owed a thank you that you never had the chance to say. Tell us how you feel about Adeline, about the father who hid the truth on his daughter's wrist, and about Emmett's final choice. Please leave a comment because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that each day, another beautiful story can be told to you. May you and your family always be blessed with good health, happiness, and peace each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.